Congratulations, Simona, for receiving the Nils Klim Award.
Thank you so much, Jørgen. It really is a great honor. I'm so thankful to the Nils Klim Committee.
In the statement, the Nils Klim Committee, they underline that you are a prolific young scholar in the areas of narratology and the theory of the novel and the concept of fictionality. They praise your ability to discuss the application of fictionality, both theoretically and historically, especially in the 18th century Danish novels. They also praise your high level of academic activity, both internationally and in the Danish context. You don't only write those international articles, but you do a lot of popularization and dissemination work. So I'd like to ask you, do you recognize yourself in this assessment by the committee?
Yeah, the committee assessment is most generous. I'm very happy that the committee has recognized both my work on the theory of fictionality and also the rise of the novel. I've tried to do foundational research in both of these areas. When it comes to the theory of fictionality, I've tried to argue that fictionality is really something that we make use of all of the time. It's not only something that pertains to fiction and the novel, but a way by which we communicate about invented states of affairs. So if you were to tell me a joke right now, I would hopefully recognize it as being a fictional story, a joke. And this is just one of the many ways by which we make use of fictionality in communication. So that's the first part of my research. That's a theoretical framework. And I'm so happy that the committee has highlighted that. And then the second area is the rise of the novel, especially in Scandinavia, but also more generally. So what I've tried to do is to combine the theoretical interest in fictionality and then use that when investigating the rise of the novel, arguing that fictionality is really the core feature of the novel and the reason why it rises in the 18th century.
Thank you. We'll certainly come back to discussing those aspects of your work. But before we come back to that, I would like to ask you if your view on such awards. It's not the first time you are an award-winning scholar already. So, what is the significance, you think, of these awards in our field of work?
Yeah, thank you for asking me that. Well, to me personally, it means a lot. I can go here and talk to you and other scholars who are interested in the areas that I've studied. But I really believe that it means a lot to the humanities in a broader sense, that the Nils Klim and the Holberg Prize exist because it highlights the importance of the humanities and the humanities as a science more broadly. So not only for us as academics, but for the general public. So I'm most grateful that I've received the award, but I'm also really grateful for what it does to highlighting the importance of the humanities more broadly.
Yes, I agree, and I think there is certainly a need in our areas to recognize the work of one another when it is, in fact, excellent. So, also wondered, could you tell us a little bit about your personal career background, how you came into the university and developed as a young career academic as you are today?
Yeah, it's actually a funny story. When I was a child, I wanted to be a writer of fiction. But when I entered university, I realized that you could also be a writer of fact and a writer of fact about fiction. So I was also interested in literature and reading literature when I was a child. But I think what fascinated me the most was really this ability we have to come up with stories that really come from our own minds, that are invented. So both in the sense of writing or coming up with stories myself, but also kind of reading stories and seeing them as enigmas, in a sense, trying to kind of decode literature. That has always been really fascinating to me. And then when I entered the university, I was really keen at an early stage on pursuing an academic career. And I think I made two quite good decisions early on in my studies. I chose to write my PhD dissertation as a collection of articles and not a monograph. And what that allowed me was to go to conferences and discuss my publications from an early time in my career. And that was really great that I was able to meet scholars and discuss what I'd already published. And the second choice was to do what we call a 4+4 PhD. And that means that you already begin your PhD studies while you're also a master student. So again, that allowed me to, I guess, become a scholar quite early, and to discuss my my research with scholars from around the world from the very beginning of my career.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, the PhD based on articles, it doesn't have such a long history in our field of research, actually, but it's more and more common, and in your experience, it's a positive thing.
It really is, yeah. I think it actually comes from the hard sciences, and then we've kind of imported it into the humanities.
But now you have a monograph lined up.
Hopefully. So that was the next step for me. I then wanted to write a monograph as well. So it's just being assessed right now, but I eventually did that as well, yeah.
And I understand, but because you have spent most of your career at Aarhus University and a research environment there, which has been fruitful, and but you also have visited some international universities.
That's quite true. So I'm really so grateful to the university where I'm based. The research centers and the programs we have at Aarhus University are really key for me. But going abroad has been immensely helpful as well. I have collaborated with scholars at Berkeley University, York University, and Ohio State universities. Those would probably be my closest collaborators abroad, scholars from those universities. And it's just something that really makes research matter when you engage with scholars who are working on the same issues and topics as you are, but around the world. And to be part of an international research environment is really key to becoming a good researcher, I think.
I think one can see very clearly in your work both what you first mentioned, the personal interest in literature, that still is very clear in what you're writing today, and makes it interesting to read, and also this mixture of the local or Aarhus context and the international collaborations. So these are qualities in your work, I think, which stands really clearly out.
I'm glad you think so.
Yeah, I think so. So we'll turn back now to your research. And as we have already mentioned, that one of the impressive features of your research is the ability to combine these historical studies, in-depth historical studies, with high-level theoretical international discussion. So sometimes when I read samples of your work, I'm not sure whether you are more a literary historian or more a literary theorist, or this maybe is a false dichotomy in your case.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Jørgen. Well, I like to think that René Werlich was right when he, in his 1946 article, Six Types of Literary History, said that a good literary historian is also a literary theorist. So I like to see myself as both a literary theorist and a literary historian. And for me, it has really been part of what has made me reconsider literary history, that I bring with me a theory that's brand new and which makes me, I think, reconsider literary history because thinking about literary history with new theoretical eyes, so to speak, can, I think, both bring forth forgotten works, but also makes us aware that the canonical works that we take for granted as being part of the canon today might also be readjusted. And then maybe as a third point, the kind of broader lines of literary history that we take for granted might also be reconsidered when, for example, as I've tried to do, we question the very core of what makes the novel the novel. So I've tried to argue that it's really not, as has been the view for many years now, realism, which is the core feature of the novel, but it's fictionality. And I think if I were to say that to a general audience, most people would maybe laugh or say, yes, of course, fictionality is a key feature of the novel. Sometimes you even equate the novel with fiction, but it just hasn't been studied that much, exactly because we take it for granted. So I think one of the things I've tried to do as a researcher is to question fundamental ideas in literary history and maybe in communication in general. So I think having a theoretical background and combining that with literary history can really change fundamental ideas and things we take for granted in our constructions of language and literature.
Yes. So René Wellick, he still has something to teach us there. Yeah. And I fully agree, and I think you succeed in using theoretical concepts on renewing literary history, which is very important. Before we get back to the literary history, I wonder if you could outline some of the basics of the theoretical discussion you're involved in, with the distinction. Important distinction between fiction on one side and fictionality on the other side.
Yeah, that's a very important distinction in my work. Together with my colleagues at Aarhus University at the Center for Fictionality Studies, we have argued that fictionality is a key rhetorical resource and not only equated with fictional genres. So within literary theory, it has been the norm to equate fiction with fictional genres. So the novel and the short story, but also the fiction movie or the series, that's kind of fictional genres. And when investigating fictionality, it has been taken for granted that we then investigate these fictional genres. But what I've tried to argue is that fictionality is a much more fundamental way of communicating than what belongs to these genres. So when I communicate about non-existent states of affairs, about imagination, that's when we use fictionality. So we have fictional genres, but we also have a fundamental way of communicating about that which does not exist. And of course, that's part of the fictional genres, but it also belongs outside fictional genres, and that's why we need the distinction.
Mm. And this approach to fictionality, this is within a tradition that is focused on the rhetoric. You mentioned that, the rhetoric of fictionality. So I wonder, could you explain a little more in depth what is this rhetorical approach to fictionality? What are the basic issues, and what are sort of the examples of rhetorical means, tools by which fictionality is signaled?
Yeah, so the rhetorical theory of fictionality has grown in the last years, and there are different positions and theories within the rhetorical approach to fictionality. But for me, it means that we signal to our audiences or our readers that what we want to communicate is invented. And in that sense, fictionality is very different from lies, because when we lie, we want to deceive someone. it's obviously also different from the truth, because we want to communicate about what's actually going on in the real world, actual states of affairs when we communicate about the truth. But fictionality is kind of on the side of truth, because we don't want our audience to be deceived when we communicate about invented states of affairs, and this is I think a very intriguing way of communication, which has been overlooked, even if it's used in everyday communication when we invite each other to imagine different ways of living, different ways of seeing the world. Also in political speeches, if a politician say, imagine that this or this will happen, it exists everywhere, really, but as a rhetoric, as a way of using language, and then, of course, also in literature. But it's not only isolated to literature. It is a way of using language, and that's why I and my colleagues have called it a rhetoric of fictionality.
Yeah. So it has to be intentional, so it has to be intended, so you have to have some comprehension of the intention of the speaker, and it also has to be signaled in a way, and these ways of signaling these are...
Yeah, that's at least my approach. I think it does have to be signaled, and the signaling can take many different forms. So the most obvious example is probably, again, the novel. If it says a novel on the front cover, that's a signal to the reader that this is fiction. And I guess nowadays that has even been kind of reconstructed, or some authors try to kind of challenge the novel label, but that's one way of signaling fictionality. But returning to the example of the joke, we talked about that earlier on, you might use kind of generic designators in everyday communication as well. If you say, oh, do you know the one about the Norwegian, the Sweden, and the Dane, then I know that this is kind of an invitation for me to think of it as a fictional joke. If you change your voice, that might also be a way of signaling that now you're imitating someone else, or you're kind of entering into a fictional mindset. So there are many different ways by which we signal to our audiences or the reader that this is a fictional story.
Yes, and of course, when we are talking to each other, then we have whole context and our bodies to signal these things. But in the text, then there are certain rhetorical tropes or...
Yeah, that might be the case as well. So the novel is the obvious and the easier example, maybe, but it could also be in the case of metaphors or tropes, and that's something we use all the time as well. Well, in literature, but also outside of literature. And I think what all of these examples have in common is that we kind of engage with each other on another level, because we invite each other into each other's head in a sense, right? Into thinking with each other, into imagining something together, and I think that has a really strong effect, an effect that hasn't really been emptied out theoretically yet, but which I'm trying to investigate myself.
Yeah, and it is fascinating. Sometimes when I read things, I wonder if is it a model where sort of the statement in itself, it has sort of a default mode that is fact or realism, and then fictionality is something you add, or is facticity also sort of a rhetorical?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Jørgen. And I think there are different takes on this question. Well, for me, I kind of believe in the idea that we have constructed our language on different maxims, so that we take for granted that we try to be honest with each other. And I think language would kind of break down if we didn't. So it doesn't mean that we are always telling the truth or using factuality, as you put it. But I do think that we believe that we have some kind of contract where we speak honest to each other, and we kind of try to convey what we believe to be the truth, and then we can deviate from that in various ways. And that's also why I believe that it's important to talk about signposts or signs of fictionality, because that's, for me at least, a kind of deviation, and that deviation might take place more or less often depending on who you are. Maybe you've met some persons who use irony all the time, and it's, for me, it's really confusing to converse with people who do that. But it's a strategy, and it's a way of communicating, and I think fictionality is one strategy and way of communicating as well. And I do believe that we need kind of a baseline of honesty or trust in order to do so. So that's my take, at least.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking, I reckon myself to be a representative of the generation of irony action, and I found it increasingly difficult in the modern society.
Yeah, I can see why, and there's nothing wrong with irony, but I've met people, where it's like 50-50. You never know whether it's ironic or not, and I don't know. Sometimes it might be a bit too much if someone uses a certain way of communicating all the time. But I do think that irony is very important, and it's a way of connecting people, and the same goes for fictionality, I think. So I've mostly studied fictionality and the relationship between fictionality and literature, but I think there's a lot more work to be done when it comes to the relationship between fictionality, irony, and other ways of communicating, and then our emotional bonds, really, and human interaction all over.
Yeah, and also, if I can come back to the award committee, the Nils Klim Committee, they state that your research highlights one of the key predicaments of our time, so it's relevant to the present cultural state. And they say one of the key predicaments, and that is the unreliability of mankind's ever-broadening technical modes of communication. Unreliability of mankind's ever-broadening technical modes of communication. That's their words. And you have, in a way, already commented on the importance of understanding and identifying these techniques of fictionality in current culture.
Yeah, so you might say that unfortunately it has become even more relevant today with the presidency of Trump and the rise of fake news, the conflation of different discourses. So I'm really grateful that the committee recognizes that research on fictionality also takes part in those discussions and might have something to contribute to the current discussions. And I do believe that making distinctions between irony, fictionality, lies, what we want to convey as the truth, is becoming increasingly important right now.
Yes, and as we have already mentioned, I think in your work you have your scholarly work, which is very clearly research work, and then you have some dissemination work where you make these connections to everyday life or present culture, and that's really impressive part of your oeuvre. So, of course, the question of irony and what is the truth and rhetoric has been much discussed in recent years, and one might say that within the postmodernism, as an academic trend from recent years, there has been a tendency to define every representation in language as fictional or at least arbitrary in some sense. So how do you see it? In a way, you have already commented on this, but how do you see your own work on fictionality, the discussion you're having, in light of the postmodernist positions. Is your project an anti-postmodernism project, or is it a development of some basic postmodernist insights of fictionality in culture?
Yeah, I think that's a really timely question. Actually, I do find it to be kind of an anti-postmodernism project if we see postmodernism as a movement that wanted to relativize everything, and that's of course only a part of what postmodernism is. But the idea that all ways of communication should be kind of equalized, and that we can't make distinctions and so on, that's really something that I want to break with, and to argue that it's really important to make these distinctions. So in that sense, you could say that it is kind of an anti-postmodernism project. And I do think that the contemporary times have proven that it is important to make these distinctions today.
Yes. Yes, I fully agree, and that's also the impression I get from your work, that the distinction between fictionality and facticity or something like that is sort of anti-postmodernism in the general sense.
It is in a sense, but of course, I'm not trying to argue that we can always identify easily what's fact and what's not, but I think the rhetorical approach to fictionality is a kind of a movement towards that. But as you highlighted, it is a question of rhetoric. So it is a question of context and trying to decode each other, which has maybe become increasingly difficult, but then also maybe it has been increasingly important to try to do so in a scholarly way.
If I should turn to a little bit more critical perspective, maybe I think that the whole approach of rhetoric to text, it has perhaps some issues that could be raised. And you write, I quote somewhere in your research, that the insight that literature is similar to other acts of communication, which of course in a purely rhetorical perspective it's obvious in a way. So, but if I should be a little bit critical there, what I find about rhetorical approaches, they often come at odds with the idea of art or the idea of literary art, that art is a fundamental way of seeing, understanding the world, and that what we as literary scholars are really looking for or cultivating is the opposite, which would be the insight that literary art is unlike all other kinds of communication. Well, we started this interview with your interest in literature and the literary, but isn't there a danger that this focus on the rhetoric of language will reduce it, and we will lose what is special about art and what is singular about art?
Yeah, thank you for raising that critical question as well. Well, I think you're quite right, and it's a very important point to discuss. So the theory of fictionality is not a theory of art, really. It's a theory of communication and rhetoric. But I think there might be two ways of looking upon this. If we view fiction as a way of communicating, I do think that we see fiction for what it is, really. We start from the most fundamental part of what it is, and that's the way we should go about researching, I think. And then the other point I want to make is that if we appreciate fiction and literature as communication, we might also appreciate it for the ways that it becomes art, because of course art is something that we decide for literature to be. And for me, at least, fictionality and invention is really one of the parts of literature that makes it art. For example, in my own studies of the rise of the novel in Denmark, I've investigated how fictional techniques developed throughout the history of the 18th century. And what I've found is that in the beginning of the 18th century, the authors do not have all of the techniques of fictionality that we are familiar with today and in the modern novel. And to give just one example, in the early 18th century novel, we see the authors having to position him or herself in front of keyholes or in cracks in walls, because he or she has to witness what is going on the other side of a wall or a door for him to be able to retell it to the reader. And this is because omniscience has not yet been invented as a fictional technique. So this is just one example of, I think, how within the novel, within fiction, we see these developments of fictionality, of our ability to use our imagination, and how that kind of becomes an important feature of the novel, and maybe something that makes it art. So what I've tried to do is to begin with the most fundamental part of what I believe fiction and literature is, that is a way of communicating, and then from there investigate, well, how does this way of communicating then develop in literary history? And maybe then as a second or third step, you might say, well, this is part of what makes it art. In one sense, you might say, yes, this is not the traditional way of studying art or arguing for the value of literature, but in the kind of third degree, it might end up being exactly that. So I do believe that by studying literature as communication, we might also realize how it is a very sophisticated way of communicating to each other.
Yes. Yes, and you do certainly demonstrate the importance of art, or the importance of the novel, and also you might say how the novel develops language, so how art plays a role in developing the language of fictionality, and
yes.
So that is an important role of literary art, of course. So I think you demonstrate that very well when it comes to 18th century literature. And maybe we'll turn now a little bit more to the historical part of your
Sure.
of your work, and then I think we have to avoid a possible misunderstanding, because the award that you have received is Nils Klim, and Nils Klim, as many will know, the name of an 18th century novel written by Ludwig Holberg, who gave his name to. We find his name in the Holberg Prize. So the prize very much alludes to something that's within your research field and your specialist field very much, but that's not necessary to get this award. This is purely coincidental in this case. You don't have to write about Holberg or Nils Klim to get these awards. So it's coincidental, but it's also a bit interesting that you have done so much work on that period, especially. So. Anyway, as an 18th century scholar, could you explain a little about what it is about this period, the 18th century, and its texts that are fascinating and relevant to us today?
Yeah, thank you for highlighting Nils Klim. It really is a curious coincidence. Yeah. I was really so thrilled when I received the prize with that name, because Nils Klim, Holberg's novel from 1741, plays a huge role in my studies. And one of the reasons for that is that it's the very first Danish novel written. So I've tried to map the rise of the Danish novel in my research, and working with Nils Klim has been especially interesting, not just because it is the first novel in Denmark, but because it participates in the first subgenre of novel that arises, which is the travel novel. So I've discovered that we actually have three succeeding subgenres of novels in the 18th century. The first is a travel novel. The second is a historical novel, and the last one is a conduct novel. And Nils Klim then kind of initiates this first subgenre of novels. And one important aspect of Nils Klim, which is important for the 18th century as a whole, is that Holberg very much discusses facts and science in Nils Klim. And I've been surprised to realize how many of the earliest novels actually deal with science. So this is one of the key research areas that I'm going to expand in the near future. And Holberg really does an amazing job by discussing contemporary, in his time, scientific debates. For example, the heliocentric universe. The very first drawing you will realize when you open the first edition, the Latin edition of Nils Klim, is a drawing of the Earth, where Nils Klim falls inside the Earth, and then there is a new universe, a new Earth inside of it, but also a sun. And of course, this partakes in the discussion of the heliocentric universe, because the sun is then not only kind of at the center of our universe as we know it, but also inside of the Earth. And this is one of the ways by which Holberg discusses science, and one of the reasons why I believe that scientific debates are really important in the 18th century fiction, and why I want to study the relationship between fact, science, and fiction in the 18th century much more. So of course, the 18th century is known as the Enlightenment century, and what I argue is that the reason why the 18th century is also the century of the rise of the novel is that the novel arises on the backdrop of a scientific discourse of factuality. So it's only with the scientific revolution leading up to the 18th century that we actually get our modern idea of what fact is based on science. So to follow that argument through, I believe that fiction can only exist if we have a scientific discourse of fact. We can only have a differentiation between fictional and factual genres once we have this kind of modern concept of what fact is. So we have to imagine then that before Holberg and his contemporaries, it wasn't possible for us to enter a library or a bookshop with shelves of fiction over here and shelves of fact over here, factual books. That was something that only came about in the 18th century. And Holberg is really a key figure in that, and Nils Klim is as well. So yeah, once again, I'm thrilled that I've actually received a prize with that very name.
Yeah, so it's mainly because you write a lot about the rise of the novel in the 18th century, and as you explain now, it's the basic precondition for that, as you see it, and for the fact that these novels, as you've written someplace, they entail the crystallization of the rhetoric of fictionality, and this is, as I understand you now, because of the rise of science.
It is,
and the factional genres of science.
It actually is. So we're used to thinking of that science and facts is kind of in this part of the world, and then we have fiction over here. But what I've come to realize is that the first books of fiction were very much about science and fact, and I do see a clear relationship between the two. And it's of course much debated what is the first novel, and how does the rise of the novel look, if we can even talk about something as a rise of the novel. But to my mind, we do see this rise of the novel in the 18th century on the backdrop of a new discourse of facts. And one of the ways that I've studied this rise, and where I've found some of my arguments for saying that the novel rises as a fictional genre in the 18th century, is to actually look at what the authors wrote about fiction. So today, we're not used to prefaces or introductory texts in novels, but in almost all of the 18th century novels, we find these introductory texts where the authors will tell the reader, well, here, dear reader, I'm trying out something new, I'm writing something that's not true, and it's also not a lie, but it's something in between. So the authors are actually telling the reader what it means that something is fictional, and that wouldn't be the case if the reader was already familiar with the fictional discourse. So this is one of my arguments for saying that the novel rises as a genre of fiction. And I can see the other main argument is that if you compare the novel to factual genres in the 18th century, you can see how some of these techniques that we've already talked about, they develop in the novel, not in other genres, but in the novel. So we both have, on the one hand, the authors who communicate about fiction and what it means that the novel is fiction, and then on the other hand, a genre wherein the techniques of fictionality slowly develop. And we don't see that before the 18th century, and we don't see it in other genres. So it is really, for me, a crystallization of fictionality that happens in the 18th century and in the novel in the 18th century.
Something that occurs to me while I'm listening to you now is that another work of Holberg, I did some research on myself, the Jewish history, is very much part of the discussion of the Bible and the fictionality or the historical critique of the Bible as a historical writing, or the elements of fiction in the Bible. And that's another place where Holberg actually discusses. And you have this modern discourse on fact fiction.
That's a really curious example as well. And one of the other 18th century novelists I've worked with, Erik Pontoppidan, he actually uses, you could say that he kind of uses Jesus as an excuse for writing fiction, because in his preface to his Menosa, which is his novel, he says that, well, Jesus uses parables and fiction, so I can do so as well. So yeah, that's a very good example. And in other texts, Holberg actually uses these parables in the Bible as a good example of what fiction is as well. So you're quite right; it's a really good example, and also an example that kind of proves to us that there weren't other genres as such that were fictional. So there were certainly fictional stories like parables, but we didn't have a genre that we could go and look up in libraries or bookshops. Thank you for bringing that.
Yeah, well, I think, as a whole, I think you're absolutely right that 18th century novels and texts, they are the crystallization of the rhetoric of fictionality, and and I think that your perspective on that is putting it very much into place and explaining it. So it's very important also for one who reads 18th century texts. It's a great power in your theories.
Thank you.
So, you mentioned that Nils Klim, that novel, it was written originally in Latin, and then part of your historical work is about the differences between different national cultures, different vernaculars, and of course Nils Klim was very quickly translated into several vernaculars like English, French, Dutch, German, and also Danish. Yeah, so this part of your work where you focus, because mostly you focus on. You also write about the English canon and the traditional European canon of 18th century, but you focus a lot on the Danish novels. And you seem to claim that they are special in a way. It gives a sort of different angle on the discussion of fictionality in the 18th century, to step out of the Danish context? Or
I do believe so, and I guess one of the things studying the Danish novel has allowed me is to do kind of an analysis of the totality of the Danish novel in a whole century, and that's not really possible in the French or the English context of the 18th century, because there were so many novels. So scholars who have approached the totality of novels in the greater novel cultures, they have done kind of distance reading, where you count maybe what characters or novels or authors are important in the century. But what the Danish novel allowed me was to actually read all of them. There are 77 in total, and it's manageable to read all of those and to then gain a new perspective on how the novel rises in a whole century. And what I found is that in one sense, the Danish novel culture of the 18th century mirrors what is going on in the great novel cultures as in France and in England. We have all of the same genres as we see in the greater novel cultures, but also novelists who are quite different and interesting in their own respects. I think one of the most important forgotten novelists that I've discovered is Carl August Thiele.
Thiele, yes.
Yeah, who writes novels within various genres and makes up all sorts of crazy things in his novels that we're not familiar with today. So you will find drawings and different languages and poems and plays. All of these kind of, for us today, strange elements for novels, but those would be populating his novels. So he's really someone that I think has been forgotten by literary history for the wrong reasons, or for reasons that I simply don't know. So yes, it did allow me a kind of totality study that then made me realize that there are different genres within the Danish novel culture that kind of precede each other: the travel novel, the historical novel, and the domestic novel, or the conduct novel, and then also kind of to focus on these novels that seem very special, even from the perspective of world literature. So Thiele writes a novel where he criticizes imperialism, where two women get a divorce, and where he tries to kind of break with the earlier tradition of the Folk Speer. There's a lot of different issues going on in his authorship, which sometimes even seems modern today.
Yes, I think you certainly you dig up a lot of novels which I think haven't been read for like 100 years, and it's very interesting because, of course, in history there are a lot of things that we can dig up, but then the challenge is to make it interesting, or to make it fit into some paradigm or some discussion, and that's what you're succeeding in, I think. Apart from just showing these interesting, funny, and different texts. But is there, when you sort of like methodically deviate from canonical works, there is also something you leave behind, and maybe the whole idea of a center periphery sort of model for culture, for European culture, is challenged in this way.
Yeah, I'd like to think so. But I mean, sometimes when digging up forgotten texts, you might also gain a new perspective on the canon that doesn't just leave it behind, but also kind of highlights the already existing canon. And I think that's the case with Nils Klim. There's another novel another text that has been perceived of as a novel that was written before Nils Klim, namely Margrethe Lassen's The Veiled Truth. I don't think many people have heard about it, but by studying that and then all of the novels that came after that, I find myself in the position of being able to say, well, it is actually Nils Klim that's the first Danish novel, because this The Veiled Truth should be seen more like a prose romance. It doesn't really belong to the canon of novels. So, in one sense, studying the forgotten texts, digging up forgotten texts, might sometimes even give me better arguments for why the canon is the canon. And of course, that's not the only reason why we want to find forgotten texts, but sometimes it goes both ways, actually.
I also found it very interesting that you, through the Thilo example, that you could take in the Folk Speer. You mentioned that, we use that German term, the Folkebøker, Folk Speer. So this phenomenon, I find, has been very little brought into the discussion of both of the development of written culture and aesthetics before.
Yeah, you're right.
Now, but now you found a way there with Thilo. You found the link.
I guess I did. But I think you're quite right. Surprisingly enough, there isn't much work done in the Scandinavian context on the Folk Speer. There is certainly some, but I think much more could be done. And in my argument for saying that the novel rises as the first fictional genre, of course I had to study the genres that preceded the novel, and we already touched upon the romance and the Folk Speer, and those were the primary prose genres that preceded the novel. Yes. And what I did in the example of Thilo and the Folk Speer was that Thilo, then he wrote a novel which focuses on a character as that kind of comes from the Folk Speer, and by comparing his novels with the Folk Speer, I could argue that he makes a fictional story of something that was actually believed to be a factual story. You can go and visit some of the historical points that are derived from the Folk Speer, but you can't do that with Thilo's novel because it was actually believed that the stories from the Folk Speer were true, and that's not the case with Thilo. So what I tried to do with that comparison was to say exactly that he comments on the Folk Speer tradition in order to kind of ridicule the reader who always just rereads the old texts and believes in them. And here comes a novel that admits that it is fictional. So yes, studying the novel also allowed me to investigate contemporary and previous genres.
And this was the Volksbuch Ugelspiel.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, a very funny Volksbuch. Yeah. So,
I'm a bit curious of the methods of your research in new historicism. I think of you as sort of a new historicist, actually, but when you do the 18th century studies, at least. So, but and it's often stressed within that paradigm that you have to not only read a lot, but read the odd stuff, like the dusty corners of the library. You have to creep in there and see what's there. And of course, digitalisation and technology has made that so much easier for us who are interested in 18th century studies, because earlier you literally had to crawl into the dusty corners of the library, but now it's all there at your fingertips. And also we have translation technology, and we have sort of search engines who makes it. It's a completely different story now than it was only 20 years ago to be a scholar of old literature. Do you use these technologies a lot in your work?
Yeah.
Or do you crawl into those dusty corners?
Well, both actually.
Yeah.
I do use technologies when it seems useful, but I've also spent hours at archives trying to dig up these forgotten texts. I spend a lot of days at an archive at Aarhus where you can look through periodicals and newspapers of the 18th century. And I did that in order to see if there were any forgotten novels hidden in those dusty corners. And I did manage to find some. So it still plays a role in the research today, I think, because some of these texts are simply too fragile to be digitized. But if they are digitized, I do use them, definitely. And the search engine is, of course, immensely useful if you want to study the rise of particular characters or characteristics and so on. But I don't find myself to be a kind of a distant reader, so to speak, a counter of literature. I'm much more interested in the close reading and combining that with actually being able to read the full corpus was just immensely useful for me.
So I sometimes wonder about that these technologies that we sometimes use and sometimes don't, they change somewhat the role of the traditional typical humanist scholar who would have his, most of the time his, but also her, personal library, collected through long travels and knowing a lot of languages, of course, and a lot of memorizing a lot of texts in order to find patterns, whereas now we can just use a search engine. So the humanist scholar isn't necessarily the same person today as he or she would be like 30 years ago, and that's something that affects our whole area, I think, because some of the importance of the humanities is sort of demonstrating the humanist person or the scholar as an erudite person, but now so much of that learning or that competence is sort of at our digitalized, So maybe that's something. I'm one generation older than you, so maybe to me that's been more of a sort of a question, identity question in a way.
Yeah.
But you as a young scholar, you're born into the world of digitalization, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess I am. Even if I sometimes forget that I am when I am sitting with those old books.
Yeah, exactly.
But
feel 100 years old.
Yeah. But I think it's something to consider, definitely. And I guess the way that I view the humanist scholar is not so much that he or she is someone who has to kind of prove him or herself through his or her values or the way that that person might be knowledgeable, but more, I guess, trying to use our abilities to think abstract and to think in philosophical ways, and then try to redefine fundamental ideas and ways of thinking to, well, I guess, making the world a better place, really. So maybe taking a step kind of forward in the sense that it's not so much in the person as it is in the real world. Maybe it's a way of trying to engage more in the real world, actually. I guess that would be my take on.
Yeah, I think it's a very good answer.
Modern humanist scholar.
So, well, we'll soon let you go now. We're approaching the end, but before that, as we now turn to sort of the modern institution of the university, it would be interesting to hear your take on the development of the modern university, because we have spoken a lot and complained a lot about the crisis of the humanities in recent years, and And I wonder, is that something that has been troubling you? You know, when you have devoted your life now to the humanities and all this, talk about the crisis. Is there a crisis? Do you perceive a crisis in the humanities?
Yeah, I guess it depends on what you mean by a crisis. There is a crisis in the sense that there are continuous cut downs on the humanities. But when we look at the knowledge that is produced by the humanities, I don't see a crisis. Again, we are here to celebrate Holberg and his scientific endeavors that has kind of been followed up through the centuries, and he was a humanist scholar in many ways, you could say. So I think one of the ways by which we as humanist scholars might change the world is to challenge the things that are taken for granted in our modern world. And I think this year's laureate of the Holberg Prize, Jørgen Sejersted, is a very good example of that, because he succeeds in combining new theories on the ecological system and economy with humanist ideas, and some of his theories about degrowth or the environmentalism of the poor it just seems so obviously right that this could and should change the world. And I think that's really what humanist scholars have the potential to do. So redefining fundamental concepts of what it means to be a human being, human rights, the world we live in, gender roles and equality, and so on. And for my own perspective, dealing with questions as how science and fact and fiction came to be what they are today is something that I think is, again, immensely important today. And I might not change the whole world, but maybe I can change a little bit, a little part of the world. So I think that the laureate of this year and what the Holberg Week stands for really proves and highlights the importance of the humanities, and that there isn't a crisis within the humanities.
So this pressure that many within the field are complaining about external funding, immediate relevance, some kind of excellence, concept of excellence. They don't disturb you as a young modern scientist or humanist researcher?
Yes and no, I would say. I think having to apply for fundings has made me rethink my research in certain ways, and that might both have a bad and a good side to it. I think it helps me not getting stuck in one idea and one research area, because I'm kind of forced to rethink myself and my research areas. And I think that is mainly a good thing, actually. Of course, you need to have foundational research, but having to rethink, having to collaborate, make new ideas come to life, I think that's something that's partly prompted by having to apply for research funding. And in that sense, I think it's not in itself a sign of a crisis. And well, it's something that the hard sciences are doing all the time as well. So why shouldn't we in the humanities? Of course, there's a limit to it, but I do think that it has helped me to revisit my ideas and to come up with new research areas. Really.
Yeah, I think it's very encouraging actually to see a young researcher who can thrive within a modern university and still, write about Thilo and Holberg and those kinds of things within that environment. So it gives hope for the future, I think. So, and then the last thing I would pose to you is your own future. You have plans now of developing a new center. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, thank you. So yeah, hopefully I will initiate a new center. I've just applied for it. So it will be the Center of the Rise of Science and Fiction. And what we want to do within this center is to investigate the ways in which science and fiction have sustained each other, have developed, and so I'm a literary scholar, and I've mostly worked on literature and the novel. But now I have a research team where we want to investigate various genres and discourses and how they interact. So we want to study not only the novel, but also school books and periodicals and scientific writings, and how sometimes scientists actually use fictionality when thinking about and conveying scientific ideas. And that's one of the things we'll do in this hopefully future center for the rise of science and fiction. So I'm looking forward to continuing my research when I return to Aarhus.
Sounds exciting, and
so
I wish you the very best of luck with your future research plans. And I also want to thank you very much for your time, for your insights, and once again, congratulations, Simona, as the Nils Klim Award winner of 2023.
Thank you so much, Jørgen.